Welcome to Health Club with Julia. I'm your host, health coach, and registered dietitian, Julia Campagna. I'm on a mission to bridge the gap between looking your best and living your life to the fullest. After years of over dieting, struggling with disordered eating, and destroying my social life, I finally found how to reach my dream physique without sacrificing the things I love. Now I'm sharing all my strategies and education with you. We'll be talking all things health, including hormones, metabolism, and lifestyle to help you cut out the confusion and start living. So get cozy and join the club. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Health Club with Julia podcast. As always, I am so happy you are here. Today's topic is going to be about macros, counting calories, that kind of stuff. This has a really big controversial topic, I feel like, because on one hand you have a lot of people that are all for macros and think that there's a lot of benefits to it and can help teach people, it's a good tool. On the other hand, you have people that are totally against that and think that you should not be counting numbers, shouldn't be weighing food, shouldn't be going to that extreme with food. And I'm somewhere kind of in the middle of that, I feel like, because I do have a lot of my clients track macros. Not everybody does it, just based on personal preferences and habits with their past and own experiences. So it depends on the client, but I do have some clients track macros because number one, I do agree that it can help teach you the basis around food and portion control, especially here in America. Our portions are not at all what they actually should be. Like, our portions are massive for no reason at all, but it can really help you understand more about portions and just the makeup of food in general, like what is a protein, what is a carb, etc. And I also do think that for people with more specific goals, like specific weight loss goals, etc., this can be really helpful in showing you exactly what you're eating, how much you need to be eating, and a little bit more efficient with that process. Now, on the other hand, I do agree that not everybody should be tracking macros, and not everybody should be tracking macros forever. Like, I know for me personally, I don't want my kids to one day look at me and be like, "Mommy, why are you weighing your food?" Like, I don't want that to be the norm for them, and I don't think a lot of people need to be tracking macros forever. I definitely stand by that, and I definitely do understand how it can be harmful for some people. That's why some of my clients don't track macros. But I want to talk today about how to know when you should stop tracking macros and calories. I mean, calories are part of tracking macros, so that's involved as well. But for those who don't know what a macro is short for macronutrient. That is nutrients that give our body energy. So these are our bigger forms of nutrition, so protein, carbs, and fats make up macros. Micronutrients are the ones that don't provide us energy, so vitamins, minerals would make up micronutrients. But that is just in a very, very short nutshell what macros are. It's just kinds of food that you're having. And so, again, like, firstly, counting macros doesn't have to mean that it's disordered eating. A lot of people equate counting macros with disordered eating, and it doesn't have to be that. In fact, when I was at my lowest and when I was in the depth of my eating disorder, tracking macros actually helped me come out of my eating disorder. Now, also, it did kind of spiral it further because I was tracking macros when I was in my disordered eating and I was making sure that I was under a certain number of calories. So it kind of did spiral more of my eating disorder, but it also, once I understood more about nutrition and I understood what my body actually needed, I still tracked macros even on my recovery journey to make sure that I was actually eating enough. So it can go both ways, but it doesn't mean that it has to be disordered. Like, counting macros is not always disordered eating, and that's a whole nother controversial topic on itself, is tracking macros in and of itself disordered eating habits, and I don't believe that it is fully. Now, it depends on the intention behind it, but I don't think that it is necessarily disordered eating. It can be bad for some people, don't get me wrong. Again, that's why some of my clients do not track macros, but it can also be very helpful for some people, like I already mentioned, the portion control, just learning the basic makeup of food itself. It can really help educate people as well. And Also, disclaimer too, macro counting is not necessary for success. I know I mentioned that it can help with more specific goals. It's just a more efficient way to meet those specific goals, which again, I do believe there's some truth in that, but it's not necessary. You don't have to track macros if your goal is weight loss. You can still lose weight without tracking macros. So just quick little disclaimer there too, like that is not something that you absolutely need to do. It's not absolutely necessary. For some people, it just helps and is more efficient for like during the process. But I'm going to be talking today about how to know when you're tracking macros for health or for control. There's a difference between the two, and one can be detrimental and one can be helpful. I'm also going to talk about how to know when to stop tracking if you're feeding into those disordered habits, and how to not stop it. Whoa. Let's backtrack. Number one, I'm going to also tell you how to stop tracking when you're feeding into disordered habits, and I'll tell you how to know when to stop tracking, even if you're doing it in a healthy manner, because again, I stand by, I don't think everybody should track forever. So I first want to talk about how to know when you're doing it for health reasons versus for control. So one sign is if you're tracking because you want to see how much variety you're getting in your food, or you want to make sure you're eating enough, or you want to help heal your relationship with food but want to lose some weight, or you already have a good relationship with food but still want to lose some weight, that you might be tracking in a healthy manner, right? So if you're tracking because you want to see how much variety you're getting, tracking does help in the sense that you know exactly what you're eating every single day, right? You're writing it all down, you're seeing it exactly how it is, and so you can see, like, you can kind of audit yourself at the end of the week and say, you know, this past week I had one fruit 3 days a week. Maybe I should try to up that next week. Or maybe I had 2 different fruits this week and maybe I want to add in a third new one next week, or just buy 2 new fruits next week. So you can kind of see what the makeup of your food is, and that can help you understand, okay, am I getting a lot of variety of nutrients in, or are my meals pretty straightforward, bland, not many differences in nutrients? Am I eating the same exact things every day? Because that also, even though I'm a creature of habit too, and I like to have like my same 3 breakfasts on repeat, I'm at least repeating those and cycling between all of them. If you're literally having the same exact meal every single day for weeks and months, you're going to want to change that up. Your body does thrive off of variety, and so macros is a good way to kind of see, are you eating the exact same things, or are you actually getting some variety in your meals? If you're wanting to make sure you're eating enough, obviously that's in a healthy manner. That was in my case. After my eating disorder, I kept tracking to make sure that I was getting enough food in my body, and so that kind of helped me understand, again, more about what my body needed, what was actually healthy for me. And I probably wouldn't have been able to eat that much, like, without tracking and having somebody hold me accountable. If I was just more intuitive after my eating disorder, I probably still would be under eating, because my body's cues were off. So my body wasn't telling me what it actually needed because they weren't there. I wasn't having my natural hunger cues. So tracking enabled me to eat as much as I needed to at the time and actually heal from that eating disorder. So that's obviously a way that you can be doing it in a healthy manner. And then, of course, if you do have a good relationship with food and you're just trying to lose weight, like I already mentioned, it could be a more efficient way to do that. So those are all ways that you might be tracking in a healthy manner. Now, how to know if you're doing it for control, let's say your whole day is consumed by tracking, you're thinking about where you're going to be eating next, you obsess over the numbers rather than what's actually on your plate, like the value of your food. If you're tracking to make sure you're intentionally eating under a certain number. These are all unhealthy signs that you're tracking macros in an unhealthy way. So again, going back to, if your whole day is consumed by tracking and then also thinking about what you're going to eat at the next meal, you are so food focused, and that's not a great behavior that we want. I remember for me personally, I would literally make breakfast, and as I was still making breakfast, think about, okay, what am I going to have for lunch? This is my breakfast now. What can fit in my macros, quote unquote, that I could have for lunch? So I would literally constantly be thinking about food. What food I was making, what food I was making next, how that food was affecting me throughout the day, if I was bloated from that food. Like, it consumed every single part of my day. So if that's the case, not so great. We don't want to be held down by thoughts of food. If you're also more obsessive over the numbers than the value of your food, that's also a little bit disordered and not a healthy behavior. Numbers are just numbers, honestly, and the value of your food, the quality of your food is so important. So yeah, my breakfast honestly is probably, or even my lunches, they're probably like 450, 500, 550 calories. So like, to somebody who was tracking macros and was looking at those numbers, those would for sure be super high calorie, and they'd probably try to cut things out of that meal. But the quality of my food is really amazing. I can have for breakfast, I don't know, maybe it's eggs, maybe it's egg whites, maybe it's a combination of those, it's some fruit, it's some veggies in there, I'll have some toast, and all of that amounts to a decent calorie amount, but I'm getting a wide variety of nutrients just in my breakfast alone. And so you want to look at the overall quality of your food, not necessarily how much number-wise are you eating. If that's the case, definitely disordered habits and something that we want to avoid. And then tracking to make sure you're intentionally eating under a certain number is definitely not healthy. Again, personal experience with that. When I was in my eating disorder, I had a certain number that I mentally could not go above. And so tracking helped me stay under that number, which was super, super, super unhealthy. And that is definitely a disordered habit. So definitely want to stop tracking if any of those things that I just mentioned you are experiencing. So now diving deeper into how to know when to stop, I split this up into a disordered edition and a healthy edition. So how to know when to stop when you're disordered eating, how to know when to stop when you're healthy eating, or healthy tracking, I should say. So we'll start with the disordered route. So how to know when to stop tracking macros if you're tracking macros in a disordered way. So if you're eating, it's kind of already going over what I already mentioned, but number one is if you're eating the exact same thing every single day and you can't deter from your usual. Going over what I said before, if you're eating the same thing every day, you want to switch things up. But if you're tracking macros in a disordered way, some people do that because they literally can't deter from what they're already eating, because they already figured out that they feel good eating that food, that it fits their macros well, and so they don't want to eat something new because it would mess up all their macros. That's disordered. If you're so number focused that you can't deter what you're eating because you know that these foods fit the puzzle of your macros, we don't want that. We don't want something so rigid and so strict that you can't have a different meal or a different ingredient within that same meal. It's okay to also have kind of the same meal but with different ingredients, or still adding more variety. So if you can't even change the ingredients of the same meal, that is definitely disordered, and we need to step away from tracking so that we can be more intuitive and just say, okay, what do I want to eat today? Let's make sure I have a protein, carb, fat, and some micronutrients within that meal, and I'm good to go. So if you physically can't deter from what you're usually eating, that's a bad sign. We want to take a step back from macros. If you also can't control yourself around food unless it's calculated, that shows you're becoming reliant on numbers rather than just trusting your body. So let's say like you're out at a party or an event and there's food around, and you go to have some food and you're not tracking. Let's say you're not tracking in this time, but you're still calculating everything in your head, like, okay, I have this and it's this many calories roughly, and it's this much protein, and I think it's this many carbs, and you're silently tracking the calories in your head, tracking the macros in your head, and you just cannot simply pick up that food and just eat it on a whim. That is also disordered behavior. and you will want to step away from macros. Your body is becoming reliant, or your mind is becoming reliant on numbers, instead of just saying, ooh, that looks really good, or this is a good protein source, let me have that. Instead of just saying, I'm gonna have X, Y, Z and going on with your day, if you're like, oh my God, calculation, let's do algebra in my head while you're looking at food, no, don't do that. I personally was doing that a lot when I had my ED. I would, if I was with friends, because I try to keep my tracking secret as well, which is another disorder behavior. I could add that to the list, I guess. If you are tracking in secret and you go out with friends or go out with family or go out somewhere and you're eating food and then you go back and you're secretly tracking it because you didn't want to track while you were with them, but you really wanted to see how much you were having, that's a disorder behavior. And that's what I was doing. I would go out with friends and not track with them because I was secret about this as long as I could be. And then I would get home and I would literally be like, okay, what did I have? Try to put it all in the tracker just to see how much I was having. And I would calculate in my head. So if I went somewhere, I would say, okay, I'm having a bowl of pasta. That seems like a lot. Maybe I should only have a quarter of that, so I'll cut it up. I would literally cut things in half because I was like, that's too many calories. Cut it in half. My mom would literally yell at me when I cut things in half. She would be like, you don't have to eat the whole thing, but you know you don't have to cut it right down the middle every time. She did call me out on that. But yeah, if you're sitting there calculating in your head and you need certain numbers to be present and that dictates your decision on if you have that thing or not, that's definitely not normal behavior, not healthy behavior, and we want to take a step back from macros so that we can learn to trust our body, trust what our body is telling us we want and we need, and be a little bit more intuitive with that. And then if you're overly obsessed with the numbers and attitude is focused around that. So again, this is personally for me, but if you go out to dinner or if you're just tracking at home and it's not fitting perfectly into your macros and the numbers are off, or it's too many calories than you thought it was, and you get really angry towards that, if you have anger or tension or stress around tracking, very unhealthy, need to stop tracking immediately. So this was something that I experienced because I would see numbers or try to calculate them in my head if I didn't have them in front of me, and I would get so angry to the point where I refused to go out to dinner a lot of the time because I was so stressed about numbers that I couldn't go out. I would get angry. I would literally get so angry if my parents were like, oh, let's go out to dinner tonight, and they just wanted to have a fun night out at dinner. I would get so angry at them. I would set a curfew. I would say, okay, I'm only going if we're home by this time. I would get really, really mad because I couldn't control the numbers I was seeing, or I knew the numbers would be off. And so that brought out emotion for me. So if you're emotionally attached to numbers when you're tracking, again, very unhealthy behavior. We want to not track anymore because, again, that's a sign that you are becoming reliant on that and you can't trust your body. So there's that. And also kind of going hand in hand with that, I guess, kind of is so a good example of this is, I remember this day actually vividly. Cheesecake Factory, things like that are kind of chain food places, they typically have calories on their menu. And I would feel really stressed going out to eat with my friends. Specifically, there was a Cheesecake Factory around my school, and I would have to get an appetizer or just stick to the skinny menu at Cheesecake Factory because the numbers were really large on the regular entrees, and I would feel so judged going to Cheesecake Factory and only getting an appetizer because everybody else was getting an appetizer and a meal and the dessert, and I just could not. And so it brought a lot of anxiety and stress out of me as well. So that is also kind of coupling with obsessing over numbers, and your attitude is focused around that. And then another sign is if you feel guilty when you go over your macros, and try to eat less the next day. So maybe you had an unplanned meal out, maybe your parents did say, hey, let's go out to dinner, and you're like, all right, fine, I will, and then you went over by mistake on your macros because it wasn't planned, but then the next day you're like, okay, I'm going to compensate for that, and I'm going to eat less today because I went over my macros yesterday. Not a good sign. Do not do that. Even my clients that do track macros, I do have them have free meals where they have chances not to track, but even if they do go out and they still track, that's personal preference for them if they do want to track that meal or not. But if they do end up or if they do go out, I always say, if this is not your free meal, track it. And that's okay if it's over. You can just learn from the experiences. And I'm not saying that in terms of, okay, you need to learn from your experience and not eat that and try to have a healthier option out or eat less or don't even go out at all. That's not the point. But it's just, these are ones who have a solid relationship with food and we're trying to reach a certain goal. And sometimes, yes, with certain goals, especially weight loss goals, there's some sacrifices that you have to make. That is point blank, like that's the reality of being in a deficit and trying to reach a weight loss goal. And so for those clients who do track when they go out, it just gives them an idea of how much they're having when they're out, and they can just see it, and it's more data points than anything else. But if you feel like you go over macros and then you stress or you feel really guilty about it, you should not feel guilty for eating certain food. And I will continue to stand by that forever. And so if you're having these, again, kind of emotions around numbers and going over and then having to feel like you have to compensate for that, we got to stop tracking. So those are some signs that if you're doing any of those, we need to take a step away from numbers and be more trusting in our body and focus more on what our intuition is saying and what our body is craving and needs. And that doesn't mean always giving into cravings, because I know for me, I have a sweet tooth, and so if I gave into cravings every single day, that wouldn't be good either. I know I need nutrient-dense foods, but if you are becoming obsessive with numbers and there's an emotion attached to it, or if you can't control yourself, or you're constantly calculating in your head when you don't have numbers or you're not tracking right at that moment, these are all disordered habits, and we really want to take a step away from those. So again, you can be more trusting in your body and not be reliant on numbers just to simply eat food throughout your day. So now let's switch over to how to know when to stop tracking macros, even if you're doing it in a healthy way. So again, macros doesn't have to be disordered. You can still track macros and be pretty healthy and have a healthy relationship with food. But here's some things that you will want to take into account if you should continue or if you should stop. So number one, when you've learned enough about the food makeup and the portion sizes, when you really feel like you've gotten a solid foundation with that, there's no need to keep tracking. Unless, again, you are going into a specific weight loss or something like that where you want to be more efficient but you still have your healthy relationship with food and it doesn't alter that, then maybe still track. But if your goal of tracking was to learn more about food and you've reached that goal, you don't have to track anymore. Once you become really good at figuring out what normal portion sizes are and what foods are made up of, you don't have to track because you already know just by looking at something, right? So I can have a meal and I'll say, oh, that's protein, that's carbs, that's fat, I'm getting some micronutrients in there, the portion's good, I'll stop when I'm feeling full. I can do all that now because I've learned a lot about nutrition and my body. And you can eventually just kind of sit down and say, and again, this isn't looking at a meal and saying, oh my god, I'm missing a carb, I need to get a carb in, or like, do I have everything, and like stressing over what's on your plate. This is when you're at the point where you can say, okay, I know about food, I know the makeup, I know the portion sizes, and so I'm going to go out to eat and I'm going to have a meal, and if I'm lower in carbs that meal, okay, maybe the next meal I have a little bit higher carbs. So you can just understand more. So once you understand the basics with food and your plate and building your plate, there's no reason for you to keep tracking unless, again, you have a specific goal, but otherwise you can stop tracking. Number two, when you've learned that eating enough isn't bad and you've been successful at eating more. So this stems from a disordered eating mindset, but now you've learned more about how to eat in a healthy way. Once you've reached that goal, then you can end. So that is pretty much my whole journey with macros, honestly. I had my disordered eating time frame and was tracking in a disordered way, and then I used tracking to become healthy, and I was making sure I was eating enough. I realized that eating more wasn't bad. It was helping me in a lot of different ways, and so I learned all that. I was successful at eating more, and so then eventually I just stopped tracking because I don't need to do this anymore. I know the basics about nutrition. I know what my body now needs. I am eating more on a consistent basis, and so I'm not going to track. Now, if you try that and you say, okay, I know that eating more is good for me, I know that I am successful at eating more, okay, great. If you try that and then stop tracking, and then you find yourself eating back to one meal again, because sometimes that does happen for people when they don't track, they just naturally undereat. If that's your case, maybe you go back onto tracking and just learn it a little bit more, and so that when you come off of it, you're not chronically dieting or undereating without even realizing it again. But I would say once you are at a spot where you know that eating enough is good for you, when you know that you are successful in eating more, feel good eating more, you can probably stop tracking after that point as well. The third sign is when you're able to balance your day without having to track everything. So this goes with that reliance on tracking. So if you're at the point where you can go out to dinner or you can take a day off tracking and it doesn't bother you, there's no emotion attached, you're not reliant on it, you're not thinking about all the numbers and saying, oh my god, how much did I eat today? How much did I eat when I was out to dinner? Then you can also stop tracking. When you can go without freaking out about not tracking, it's a good sign. When your body's not reliant on it and you know, like, I know the basics of food, I know what my body needs, I know portion control, and I'm not stressed over tracking numbers, that's all good signs that you can stop and you have a pretty good relationship with food. And the fourth thing is when you finished your deficit and gone back up to maintenance. So after a deficit, it is important to, and I teach my clients this a lot as well, is when you're done with the deficit, maybe doing a small reverse diet back up to maintenance, or just jumping back up to maintenance and hanging out there for a little bit, because we don't want to stay in a deficit forever. That can be really detrimental to our overall health if we're doing it for a long period of time. So we want to be able to get back up to maintenance, maintain the results that we're having, so that also, we're sitting at maintenance, we're feeling good, we're not feeling hungry all the time because we're eating a decent amount after our deficit, maintaining the results. If you're not doing that and you are just chronically dieting for a long period of time and never go back up to maintenance, that's when a lot of people actually rebound because they've been in a deficit for so long that they get really hungry at certain points, and then they just continue to eat more and more and more. Maybe they binge and then they gain it all back. So I like to take my clients through a small reverse, or just kind of jumping back up to maintenance after a deficit, so that we know we can maintain our results here, we know how much we should be eating at maintenance, and we're kind of sitting in a good spot. Then I would say you can stop tracking macros, but I would still try to track macros until you're at maintenance for a few weeks, a couple months maybe, and then wean off of it after you feel like you're at a comfortable spot with your intake and also just maintaining kind of where you're at. And that's like my 4 main things to think about when wanting to stop tracking macros if you're doing it in a healthy manner. And then I also want to go over how to stop tracking, because some people can cut tracking cold turkey and they're just like, oh, I'm done. That was me. I had tracked for so long that at one point I was just like, I don't want to do this anymore, so I'm gonna stop tracking macros, and I just cut it out, and there was no process to it. But some people can't, and that's the people that are maybe reliant on it and they need to learn to trust their body. That's a really good example of why some people shouldn't cut cold turkey, because then you fall into the trap of calculating in your head and getting anxious about numbers and that kind of stuff. So if you can't just cut cold turkey, your body won't trust you enough to just eat intuitively. If you're not at that point, but you still don't want to track anymore, I would wean off of it and start a little bit slower. So maybe don't track one day during the week, and once you feel really comfortable with that, then don't track a whole weekend. And once you're comfortable with that, then don't track 4 days, and then eventually you'll stop tracking altogether. And then another important note to say with this method is make sure, like, if you are weaning off of it, and let's say at some point you are just not tracking on the weekends but you're